Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Ernest Becker Foundation webinar. The Ernest Becker Foundation examines the ways in which the human awareness of our own mortality affects our beliefs and behaviors on both an individual and societal level. Today's topic is the intersection of Ernest Becker, Otto Rank, one of Becker's biggest influences, and psychotherapy. My name is Dina Gohari, and I'll be the moderator for today. I'm a PhD student and researcher at the UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, and my current research area is neurodevelopmental atypicality, specifically autism spectrum disorder. I first came across Becker when I listened to the Denial of Death on audiobook on an 11-mile hike in Berkeley, California. Ever since that day, I think I've just stuck to his teachings like white on rice on a personal level as well as on a professional level. It is both an honor and a privilege to be your moderator this morning. We'll have three panelists today. Dr. Sheldon Solomon is a professor of psychology at Skidmore College. Dr. Solomon is a co-founder of terror management theory, which examines the effects of the uniquely human awareness of death on behavior. TMT has now been supported by over 1,500 studies, demonstrating the unique effects of mortality on human behavior. His research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, and he is the author of countless articles and books on the topic, such as The Worm at the Core, on the role of death in life. Dr. Claude Barbre is a distinguished full professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and a board member and training supervisor at the Chicago Center for Psychoanalysis. He is a teacher and psychotherapist with nearly 40 years of experience. An Otto Rank scholar, Dr. Barbre, is currently completing a book entitled Soul Diver, Otto Rank's Psychology of Religion. You can't be a fan of Becker without being a fan of Otto Rank, so it's a pleasure to have you here with us, Dr. Barbre. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Kirk Schneider, co-founder and president of the Psychotherapy Training Center at the Existential Humanistic Institute, as well as an adjunct faculty at Saybrook University. He is a leading spokesperson for existential humanistic and existential integrative psychology. Dr. Schneider is the author of 13 books, virtually all inspired by Becker, including his most recent work, Life-Enhancing Anxiety, Key to a Sane World. Dr. Schneider's current focus, very much in keeping with terror management theory, is on the existential bases of polarized states of being, as well as their alternatives. Welcome again to all. The panelists will each now talk a little bit about their respective fields and discuss the crossover between them. And then we will open the Q&A. First up, we have Dr. Solomon to discuss how Becker and Rank inspired the field of terror management theory.
Well, thank you, Dina, and thanks everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be on the same panel with Kirk and Claude and to talk about the intersection of Becker's ideas and how they might be parlayed into practice, both in terms of individual psychotherapy and then just broader efforts to improve the psychological well-being of everybody. As you've already mentioned, Becker was very much influenced by Otto Rank and dedicated the book, The Denial of Death, in honor of his influence. And basically what Becker does in order to delineate the motivational underpinnings of human behavior is to start with Darwin and saying we're like any other living creature in that we're biologically predisposed to want to continue living. On the other hand, we're distinctly unique in that we have the sublime capacity by virtue of cognitive complexity to imagine things that don't yet exist, and then to actually take our imagination and actualize it. Otto Rank put it the way I like it the most: only humans make the unreal real. And according to Becker and following Kierkegaard and Rank, one of the byproducts of cognitive complexity is the awareness that we exist. And Kierkegaard said that if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you're necessarily going to experience two uniquely human emotions that he described as awe and dread. I like how Otto Rank puts it when he says that by virtue of consciousness, we realize that we're the temporal representatives of the cosmic primal force, which seems quite obscure at first if you're not in the 1960s full of hallucinogens. But the point is that, the cosmic primal force, Rank is saying, hey, we're all directly descended from the first living entity and therefore related and connected to everything that's ever been alive, everything that's now alive, everything that will be alive in the future. And there's something awesome and uplifting about that cosmic connection, and why I would submit that our finest moments are just the spontaneous joy and exuberance and awe that comes from being alive and knowing it. On the other hand, there's the dreadful downside, and that is that if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you also realize that, like all living things, your life is of finite duration, and that you too will someday die, not only at some vaguely unspecified future moment, but maybe in the next minute as a comet crashes through the window and vaporizes me. Moreover, just to knee us in the psychological groin, Becker adds the Freudian idea that Rank also subscribes to, and that is that we are extraordinarily uncomfortable at the prospect that we're embodied animals, as we glibly put it, breathing pieces of defecating meat, no more significant or enduring than lizards or potatoes. And according to Becker and Rank, these realizations, I'm going to die, I could die in a moment, spam with a plan, but I've got no can, would reduce us to psychological rubble if we did not have a way to manage that terror, which, according to Becker, is accomplished by embracing cultural worldviews, beliefs about reality that we share with those around us, that serves to minimize death anxiety by giving us a sense that our lives have meaning and value. And according to Becker Rank, terror management theory, the argument is that we are, whether we're aware of it or not, fundamentally motivated to preserve confidence in our cultural beliefs as well as faith in our value in the context of them, which Becker calls self-esteem. And that's our primary motivation, is to minimize death anxiety in pursuit of meaning and value. Rank goes a little further, though, in ways that I appreciate, and that in the way that Becker describes it is in terms of the twin ontological motives. We're afraid to die, and Otto Rank says that's what makes us want to stick out. And yet we're also afraid to live, and that makes us want to fit in. And so life is kind of a delicate balance of trying to be distinguished as well as trying to fit in. And too much of either motive results in existential guilt. If you desire to stick out too much, you're a narcissist. If you desire to fit in too much, you're a culturally constructed meat puppet who sacrifices your individuality and is subject, as Rilke, the poet, put it, to the guilt of unlived life. Well, the question then arises is, how do we know if Becker's ideas are, quote, true? Well, by conventional scientific standards, as Dina has mentioned, terror management theory is now, there's now almost 40 years of research, more than 1,500 studies that provides convergent support for these ideas through work that shows that self-esteem buffers anxiety, that reminding people of their mortality makes them strive to defend their cultural worldviews and bolster their self-esteem, and that threatening cultural worldviews or self-esteem makes thoughts of death come more readily to mind. And so we know, for example, that when people are reminded that they're going to die, that they become more hateful and hurtful to other people, more likely to vote for populist or fascist political leaders, more uncomfortable with their bodies, more concerned about having money and stuff. Well, what does all of that have to do with therapeutic concerns? Well, here Becker and Ronk, well, they anticipate what Erwin Yalom says in Existential Therapy in 1980, and that is that one way of viewing psychological disorders is, as Yalom puts it, that they are clumsy modes of dealing with terror. And indeed, this is not to suggest that death anxiety is the cause of every psychological difficulty, so much as that it may be implicated. And there is empirical work showing that death reminders increase everything from like spider phobia to obsessive compulsive behaviors to social anxiety to psychological dissociation. And so this kind of gets us to where I should shut up, and that is, well, what are the implications of these ideas for therapy? And here I'll leave us with two thoughts. One is that both Ronk and Becker had some misgivings about therapy. They saw it as potentially problematic to the extent that it just becomes a narrow fetish where the client or the person interested in being helped just kind of transfers their insecure attachment from one transference object to another, and where the therapeutic stance of the therapist just becomes the cultural worldview of the patient. Moreover, one of my favorite Ronk phrases that I don't pretend to understand is when Ronk says that he's given up on therapy because it's a, quote, preponderantly negative and disintegrating ideology. I think what Ronk was saying, but Kirk and Claude, you'll interpret for me, is that sometimes therapy can just kind of get us narcissistically preoccupied with ourselves as the sole cause as well as solution to all of our problems. And that just gets us into a perseverating cycle of negative introspection. Having said that, though, both Ronk and Becker were committed to what I feel like are very productive approaches to psychotherapy, following kind of Albert Camus' edict to come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible. But this is not to say that the sole focus of this kind of approach to therapy should be solely concentrated on death anxiety. As Kirk and Claude know better than I, the broad approach to existential psychotherapy in Rollo May and Yalom, they talk more about universal concerns, about death, freedom and choice, isolation, and meaninglessness. Kirk and Claude will update us because I think that the field has gotten much more broad in that regard. So I've already overstayed my welcome, and so let's move on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sheldon. Your enthusiasm is absolutely infectious. So next up, we have Dr. Schneider, who will give an overview of existential integrative therapy. Welcome. Oh, Dr. Schneider, I'm going to ask you to unmute really quickly so we can hear you. Happens to the best of us. Thank you.
This is the existential challenge of techniques, technology, but Thank you so much, Dina. And thank you, Sheldon. It's great to be here, an honor to be here with you and with Claude and Lila, and all of you who have assembled here. Much appreciate this opportunity. So I'm going to be echoing parts of Sheldon's eloquent overview, hopefully adding some therapeutic elements to the mix, and it'll be interesting to engage in this all together. My belief is that if we want to understand the therapy of Becker and Rank, then we have to understand our relationship to existence, not only our relationship to our physiology, our cognition, or our behavior. We need to understand our plunge into a vast unknown sea, basically, and how to negotiate that. In a nutshell, we need to understand what Rank calls the trauma of birth, and what I call the drama of birth, because I don't believe it's just trauma. And I was so privileged to actually preside at my son's birth, and I definitely saw elements of terror and paralysis, but I saw him looking around and what really felt like a lot of wonder as well. But nevertheless, it is an extremely stressful and obviously powerful moment. And as Rank puts it, or the way I'd summarize Rank here, is that the trauma aspect of birth really relates to that radical shift from relative non-being and unity to sudden abrupt being and pandemonium, where we are basically floundering. It's a state of groundlessness and helplessness that I believe in many ways forms the template for all, or at least most or much, of future anxiety, trauma, and when we're just thrown as human beings. We also need to understand the whole problem of how we are met at this crucible of that radical shift and that cleavage from the cosmic and through the mother. How are we met? That is critical, and that is critical to the whole existential, humanistic, existential, integrative, depth therapeutic enterprise, in my view. How are we met by our parents, our caretakers, and the culture that surrounds us? Are we met with fear-driven rules and regulations and forms of devaluation? Or are we met with supportiveness, with responsivity, a degree of openness to the radical encounter of the infant with difference, as Rank so beautifully emphasizes, the whole psychology of difference that we come into, that is born at that point. The encounter with radical otherness, because let's face it, when we are thrown into life, we are thrown into all kinds of strange objects, places, beings, and those pose, I think, experiential threats, psychical threats as well as physical. So what is the holding environment, as D.W. Winnicott also beautifully put it, that is co-created between infant and parents' culture? It's in some sense, the entire therapeutic enterprise is about helping us to work with and address this primal fear, this primal severance. And so that's what I want to move into. But before I do that, I also would like to give it a bit of another frame that I've been working a lot on with this new book. And that is really, I call the project of helping us come to terms with this primal terror and when wonder, life-enhancing anxiety. So the therapy is very much about the ability to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. In other words, it's helping us to develop a form of anxiety, arousal, if you will, that very much includes the elements of wonder and discovery, not just dread and paralysis. That's hopefully what we can come into with what I call existential integrative therapy, which is one way of understanding and coordinating a variety of bona fide therapeutic approaches, including the physiological and cognitive, within an overarching existential or experiential context. And the basic aim of existential integrative therapy is to help people find ground within groundlessness, however that is best done for them in those moments you are encountering it. And that's why I do think medicine is sometimes helpful, get people through the night. Basic programmatic advice sometimes is very helpful. But I would say at the deeper levels, for fundamental healing to take place, for many people at least, they need to come to terms with this primal fear that I just referred to. And not just intellectually and not just through behavioral conditioning, but with their whole body experience, through what many of us call presence, the holding and illuminating of that which is palpably significant between therapist and client and within the client. So I know it's a mouthful, we can unpack it later. But the basic issue here is helping to co-create that holding environment that allows us to swim more freely in that vast unknown sea and negotiate the strange creatures and places that we come into. So I'm a former swimmer, actually. So I can relate to this metaphor. It takes a while to learn how to stay present to oneself in that suspense to the point where one can feel more free-flowing. But that's a lot of what the work's about, and it's done through, to a great extent, through the mirroring of the therapist, both passive and active mirroring of the therapist to the client's battle, the part of themselves that's attempting to break through and liberate themselves, whether that's toward a project, a relationship, a meaning in life. And the mirror also is toward what blocks that client from breaking through, what stops them. And it's through the revisitations to that crucible where the client sees closer and closer up, both what's trying to really break through, how they really want to live their lives, and how they keep crushing themselves. And you do that enough times, hopefully in a facilitated relationship, you will be able to come to the point where you develop this counter will that Ronk talks about, of overthrowing the self-protections and breaking on through to your fuller flowering as a person. We can call this the sense of awe in its ideal form, which I call the humility and wonder, sense of adventure toward living. It's a capacity to stay both acutely with our deepest vulnerabilities, but also at the same time, our great capacity to transcend those and to inquire, to venture out, to take risks, both with our therapist and in life. So I'll wind this up then with the following quotes by Becker following Kierkegaard and Ronk, and what they meant by maturity. Becker says, if there is tragic limitation in life, there is also possibility. What we call maturity is the ability to see the two in some kind of balance in which we fit creatively. I really like that. I mean, that's echoing again Sheldon's notion of the balance in encountering death anxiety, helplessness, and groundlessness. And finally, I love this quote from Becker. It may sound a bit darker, and stereotypically existential than I think a number of us see the field, but it also highlights a more profound sense of awe that I think many of us could use pursuing in our lives. So Becker states, whatever is achieved must be achieved from within the subjective energies of creatures, without deadening, with full exercise of passion, of vision, of pain, of fear, and of sorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirk. Beautifully said. So finally, we'll turn to Dr. Barbre, who will discuss Ronk and Becker from a psychotherapist's standpoint. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here and to be with Sheldon and Kirk. I also feel that, there's maybe what Derrida talked about is spectrality. I feel Esther Menaker's presence here very keenly. She always said, when you have tea, you have three bags, one for you, one for the person serving, and one for whoever shows up. And I feel like we're having tea with Esther in many ways. She would really enjoy gathering to talk about Ernest Becker and Otto Ronk. She also was one of the great writers of immortality strategies, in the sense of how we internalize others and they become part of who we are as traces in our lives, as a particular strategy, which she saw more in a Cohoutian way, in a sense. But she talked about, really, maybe there's a spiritual dimension in psychology that is a memory of love. And I certainly feel that sort of immortality strategy at work here in talking about Ronk with you today. And it's a pleasure to provide a short response to the presentations by Kirk and Sheldon on their rich ideas that reimagine the many interlinking threads of Ernest Becker and Otto Ronk's writing and contributions. And these are links that show how each generation rediscovers Ronk's vision, and, as Winnicott would say, creates anew what one finds and discovers. Ronk's work continues to draw many interdisciplinary voices in ever-widening studies, and Kirk's writing on existential integrative therapy and the search to find ground within the groundlessness of one's life struggles, and Sheldon's work on terror management theory echo many themes in Otto Ronk's profound descriptions of the paradoxical contingencies of the human dilemma, such as separation and togetherness, life and death fear, death anxiety and immortality strategies, creative will and counter will, the artist against herself, existential guilt, the anxiety of being, the volitional affirmation of the obligatory meaning the inevitability of death, and self-becoming. So I'll touch on a few of these just to begin our discussions. As Sheldon mentioned, Ernst Becker remarked that to live is to stick out and to go beyond safe limits. Hence, it is to court danger and to be a locus of the possibility of disaster. So a truly lived life then becomes its own burden. And a willingness to accept this paradox includes a volitional striving to transcend it. Otto Ronk achieved such an intensity of individuation, and in so doing experienced the dangers and dilemmas inherent in the singularity of a creative life. Becker too knew about the lived dilemmas we face as humans confronting life and death fears, adding to Ronk's own thinking from the 1920s and 30s. As Dan Ligny notes, that Becker, influenced by Ronk, noted that there is an important element of uniqueness in human beings. Specifically, the human beings have the mental capacities to create a symbolic sense of self. That is, a capacity to imaginatively stand outside of oneself and reflect back on oneself. On one hand, a survival mechanism, and on the other, an awareness of one's own mortality, as Sheldon mentioned earlier. Hence, at the core of every human being, as we see in these presentations, there is a psychological, emotional, and spiritual conundrum, the overwhelming desire to continue living, coupled with the cognitive recognition of the fact that we will one day die. To wonder about one's death is to encounter a subjective consciousness, a self-image of the self as an ego separate from the objective world. For example, a 5-year-old boy I was working with had been talking to his parents about death, something he had just discovered. He asked his parents if they would miss him, and they said, yes, very much, very much. And they told him how much they loved him. And he said, that was good. And then after a long pause, he said sadly, you know, I think I would miss myself. As with Ronk's departure from Freudian theory, Becker thus posits that it is less the pent-up frustrations of sexual and aggressive drives that conflicts with civilization, and which forms the deepest wellspring of repressed material in the dynamic unconscious. Rather, much more so, it is repression of this awareness of one's own mortality that undergirds, activates, enhances, as Kirk says, energizes the human unconscious. Robert Kramer underscores this point when he notes that Ronk, as well as Jean-Paul Sartre and Viktor Frankl, C.G. Jung, Rollo May, and we can certainly add our speakers today, posit the notion of the existential unconscious, essentially a recasting of the psychoanalytic conception of the unconscious in existential terms, or as Kramer puts it well, quote, Ronk in his trauma of birth peered below biological bedrock in Freudian terms to confront the ontological, or better, the pre-ontological mystery of being itself. That is the awesome difference, the ineffable difference between non-existence and existence, unquote. In essence, suffering is connected with the struggle to affirm one's difference. It is important to note that the word difference has the same etymology as the word suffer, being the Latin fere, to bear. To bear also refers to birth and carrying. Kramer notes that Ronk discovered the existential unconscious and unconscious far more anxiety-provoking than Freud's writing on sexual desire and castration, fear, and guilt. As Ronk would write, the mere fact of difference, the existence of our own will is opposite, unlike, is the basis for self-condemnation and inferiority or guilt feelings, adding that the difference between non-existence and existence precedes all differences. How then can we live, can we bear this relentless reality of mortality awareness? As we see referenced in today's talks, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death 50 years ago this year, Becker argues that the whole of human society is at its core a symbolic defense mechanism protecting us from the terrifying consciousness of our own temporality. Humans are able to transcend the problem of facing their own death through what Becker, following Ronk, calls immortality projects, or becoming a hero in a sense. By becoming something greater than themselves, humans can create meaning in their lives by believing that whatever they dedicate themselves to will live on beyond their individual material lives. For Becker, a failure in a person's immortality project allows the terror of death to enter consciousness, resulting in the potential for disturbances or psychopathology. The major problems for humankind, according to Becker, occurs when immortality projects are at odds with each other. And this is the driving force for violence such as war and genocide. For Becker, uncovering the motivations behind human actions and unveiling the denial of death can result in clearer approaches to and management of conflicts, furthering resolutions. Differing from Sigmund Freud's emphasis on instinctual oppositions, the interface between life and death is echoed in Ronk's view of the will phenomenon as presenting a basic paradox inherent in the life force. We require, indeed, we must have closeness, connection, and acceptance in order to survive. Yet self-actualization requires separation and differentiation. Hence, too much closeness can impede separateness and the birth of individuality, leading persons to fear the loss of their own distinctiveness necessary to their lives. This can create what Ronk calls a death fear in regard to the stifling of one's individuation. However, the fear of death from too much separation is clear from the start of life. The movement toward independence gives rise then to a fear of abandonment, isolation, and destruction. Ronk calls the fear of individuation the life fear. We are caught between the desire for and fear of self-affirmation, and this becomes heightened as we grow to more developed cognitive capacities and notice consequences of our actions as well as the reactions of others. Ronk asserts that the affirmation of one's difference is a manifestation of the will toward individuation, which is expressed in the person's creative expressions. According to Ronk, that the creative will originates in the drive for self-actualization, introduces the human dilemmas of separation and relatedness. Separation is one of the fundamental life principles, and it's a key source, as we've heard, of existential guilt and anxiety, and our lives are continuous separations. A dilemma is clear. Self-awareness of our mutability is one of the most powerful psychological forces in us. The self-actualization, so necessary to each person, can only be attained through separation, which symbolizes death. But the creative impulse releases an inevitable duality in life itself. The duality represented by the movement toward individuation on the one hand, and a need to remain part of a larger whole on the other. The more we become self-conscious of our unique personality, the greater the urge to eternalize it. We see this phenomenon dramatically explored in Sheldon's writing, where we see that we seek to transcend mortality by connecting ourselves to a group or a cause or ideology which extends beyond the self. These connections are seen as surviving the self. This reaching out includes artistic creation as a means toward individual immortality. Ronk was clear that no matter how one attempts to deny the difference in himself or herself or others, to make everyone equal and the same, the uniqueness of each life will prevail. In conclusion, talking about psychotherapy and Ronk, in the development of psychoanalysis with Shandor Ferenczi, Ronk championed living and reliving emotional, affective experience in therapy. They emphasized the therapeutic experience and the viability of action over verbal memory, focusing on the here and now experience. Later, Ronk expanded its work into what he would call relationship therapy. In 1926, the development of psychoanalysis anticipates Ronk's lifelong emphasis on the curative effect of what he calls emotional experience, Erlebnis, over privileged intellectual understanding, Einsicht. As Kramer says about Ronk's insight, quote, "It is not the infantile past, but the living present, the Erlebnis of one's own difference, the consciousness of living with all its painful feelings, thinking, and acting that patients deny, forget, or wish to escape." In short, Ronk believed neurosis is the result of an individual's inability to affirm his or her or their difference, his or her or their unique idiom given from birth. This is a failure in creativity rather than sexuality. Affirmation of one's difference is a manifestation of the will toward individuation that introduces the dilemmas of separation and relatedness. Difference and the volitional affirmation of this difference is the aliveness, the emotional experience that many patients have never before been willing to accept fully and consciously without feeling overwhelmed by angst or guilt. As Ronk said, the feeling of this emotional experience, purposefully and with intent, is made the central factor in the therapeutic task. In kind, Becker's work reflects Ronk's powerful awareness of the paradoxical nature of life and the transformation of the compulsion of will to the freedom of will that abides in the crucible and play of likeness and difference, and as we have heard today, the ground within the groundlessness and life-enhancing anxiety toward life in our lived experience. Thank you very much.
Wow, I am absolutely stunned. That was just incredible. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Before we open up the Q&A, I'm wondering, do any of our panelists have any follow-up questions for each other?
I don't have a question. I just want to reinforce Claude's emphasis on the emotional experience via Ronk. And so much of existential experiential therapy is focused on that precisely because you really have a hard time getting to that primal anxiety in the here and now by intellectualizing it or interpreting it, in some confined categorical way. You need to help the client to stay with the embodied challenges that they're experiencing, so that they can heal with their whole body experience and not just a part. And also, I think that's why clients start referring metaphorically to those deeper places of struggle rather than directly. They talk about it as being in a free fall, in a black hole, a bottomless pit, cut from the mothership. I mean, that's at the crux of much of what we call psychopathology.
Yes.
Thank you so much for commenting on that, Kirk. I'll go ahead and start off the Q&A. This is a question that's sort of directed at any of you. At what point does dwelling with death anxiety become life-denying? In other words, what is the proper amount of dwelling with existential death anxiety? And on your view, how might recent developments in psychopharmacology fit into this discussion?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm happy to go backwards. The recent studies of psychedelics on the relief of death anxiety are profound and profoundly important. And this is not the time to point out that there was a vast literature on these matters in the 1950s before the hippies ruined it by turning psychedelics into recreational activities. But I do see that as a potent way, at least at the outset, to contribute to managing death anxiety. I'll defer to the others in terms of the beginning of the question.
Well, I echo Sheldon there. A number of these studies of psychedelics seem quite promising in terms of their ability to help people to manage their profound anxieties. I think we need more studies, especially in the long term, and especially in terms of what it's like for the person day to day and outside the controlled settings of the experiments. I know personally that having had a very in-depth psychoanalysis when I was a small child was extremely important to me after a major trauma that I had experienced. And I think if I was that small child today and I was hit with a lot of drugs, I'm talking mainly about illicit drugs now, I may have really been shortchanged in terms of learning beginnings of how to just more naturalistically grapple with my challenges. And what is, they said, the appropriate degree of death anxiety? That, I think that's a soul-searching question for each individual. It's
Right.
hard to give a blueprint for that one.
Yeah, I was thinking how Rollo May said, with every client, you need to have a new therapy or a new theory, a new approach. So there's not so much a blueprint in terms of death anxiety. You can read someone like Robert Langs, who talks about all kinds of red flags that may point to death anxiety, like the person who changes their times frequently, and certain action behavior that may point to that. But my sense is that that each person has their own particular idiom and experience, and so there's not really a particular blueprint around the anxiety itself. I was thinking, for instance, when Kurt was just talking about his therapy as children, Anna Freud's first child patient, Peter Heller, was referred to her because of anxiety. And it's a really interesting story. Esther told me about it, and how one day he was leaving the session, and he stopped at the door, and he turned and he said to Anna Freud, he said, "Dr. Freud, thank you so much. You helped me a lot with my feelings of anxiety, but I have one request." And she said, "What's that?" He said, "Please don't take all of my anxiety away. I may need some of it." And Anna Freud said, "Don't worry, the world will not let us." But I love that story because, it's very much what your book is about, Kirk, in many ways, is that, Anna Freud told Esther, smart little boy, because anxiety does have life-affirming needs and also can be signals in many ways. So I think in many cases, I just say one more thing. It's a great question. Ferenczi talks about, how a child is met, echoing Kurt's statement about meeting the child is, really about 60 years before Winnicott was talking about the holding and facilitating environment. Ferenczi talked about, being welcomed. He talked about the unwelcome child, and he said that if a child has experience of aversion or a bad reception, that there's a tendency for the life experience to be foreclosed by a tendency toward a kind of diminishment. And at first he talked about that as a death instinct, but he later changed it and saw it more as an attempt just to hold on to some sense of life. And he called it a search for tranquility, a sense of peace. And he kind of subtended then the notion of instinct language that Freud was using. And I think that Ronk really picked up on that in their conversations. Instead of, not only is the relationship important in terms of how one experiences death anxiety, but it's also, how one's met, and then what the history in some way is being brought to the here and now. Sometimes we are welcoming our clients for the first time in their lives. And I'd finally say around that is Margaret Lawrence, who a wonderful analyst. Margaret said that we talk often of rehumanizing individuals who've been dehumanized, but she said sometimes people haven't been humanized to begin with. And she said sometimes therapy is the therapeutic space is, as Winnicott said, it's a sacred space. It's the sacredness of the occasion is to discover our humanity sometimes for the first time. So your point about meeting the client really has a tremendous impact on the different levels and valences of death anxiety. So it's a very good question, I think. I would find one last thing is that I think from time immemorial, we have sought ecstatic identities and healing since shamanism. And so I think indigenous healing methods that are now integrated more into our cultural mindfulness, that something around the psychedelics, psychotropics, or really essentially has an ancient sense of a holding environment and circle that has always been in the human search. So I think it's a kind of revisitation of the sacros, or the sacred again, that we're seeing and rediscovering that particular, I think, really almost ritual in some way.
Thank you so much for that response. Everybody's responses were so wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and segue into our second question. This one is directed at Dr. Solomon and Dr. Schneider. So, where and how does the emerging science of self-transcendence fit into terror management therapy and existential integrative therapy? Relatedly, has TMT been used in therapy or clinical research?
Should I start, Kirk? Say the beginning of that again, Dina. I'm sorry, just to be sure I'm not way out of the gate.
Of course. Where and how does the emerging science of self-transcendence fit into terror management therapy?
Okay, yeah, in an awesome way, not to use a bad pun, because what's happening, and Kirk and I go way back, and then we didn't kind of see each other for a few decades, and then after, like, in this millennium, I'm like, wow, there's a remarkable convergence. For a couple of, in the last century, TMT, we were the dread people. Kirk was the awe people. And then the positive psychologists didn't want to have anything to do with either of us. And I'm being silly, but not, because both conceptually as well as from an evidentiary point of view, it is now very clear that awe, humility, and gratitude are the psychological foundation of flourishing and well-being, and have been shown to minimize, if not eliminate, all of the defensive reactions that death reminders produce in our studies. And so when we remind people they're going to die, they're more likely to kill somebody because they look different, or vote for Donald Trump because he says only I can fix it. Well, that's bad. But if we put people in a momentary state of awe, gratitude, or humility, they do not behave in that rather unsavory fashion, and B, feel a whole lot better. So I think we're on the vanguard of the interface between what we have been up to and what therapists, going back to Ronk and now Claude and Kirk, have been thinking about, just in terms of their own clinical practice. And so, Kirk, why don't you take over? But my view is we're really drifting in a very interesting and fine moment where the research and the clinical work seems to be converging on the importance of all of the ideas that Kirk and Claude mentioned about whole body experience, the importance of the holding environment. And I love Claude's reference to my favorite Ronk quote, almost, the voluntary affirmation of the obligatory. And so anyway, I think there's a very nice correspondence.
Yeah, from my own perspective, it's very much about the degree of access we have, again, to our deepest dreads as well as our most dazzling desires. The fuller ranges of our thoughts, feelings, sensations, imaginings. And I think that sensibility of awe captures that beautifully, because it's one of the maybe rarer transcendental terms that is squarely pegged on paradox, the paradoxes of the human condition, the humility, the capacity to recognize our smallness, get out of our own way, and our great capacity to transcend that, to create, to imagine, and to experience participating in something much greater than ourselves. I think this is what we're talking about. Unfortunately, I think sometimes these terms can get a little bit commodified and commercialized, and I'm a little concerned about even the sensibility of awe, neglecting the daunting element that is so important for many of us who have experienced a sense of awe in a very, I don't know what the word is, a profound experience of that. At least for me, has to include the sense of the daunting, of some degree of death anxiety, groundlessness and helplessness. I mean, how the hell are we, when we're most deeply moved, how can we be that deeply moved if it doesn't include an element of, floundering and of our vulnerability? And so that's part of my mission, is to help to fill out that sense of awe that gets bandied about a little too much, I think, on the sort of positive side. And to me, that's a wonderful form of transcendence, if that's relating to the questioner.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we're going to go lightning round mode for the next couple of questions or so. So this will mean keeping our answers pretty brief, around 30 seconds or so, if possible. And we are currently waiting on the third question. Here it is. So the literature on the contemporary mental health crisis shows that psychotherapy is available to a small minority. How can we inspire a wider audience, and how do we find the human resources that are needed?
Well, I can begin first. I'll try to be very quick. In my presidential campaign for the APA, I called for a national corps of psychologists. You could call it a national corps of mental health professionals to spread throughout the country and provide services in all our specialties, and especially provide what we call emotionally restorative relationships. Make them much more accessible, much more affordable, especially in marginalized areas, underserved areas, so that the youth can have availability to the kinds of relational contacts that we've been making explicit here from earlier ages, like some of us have had that great privilege to have had, to set them much more on a path where they feel seen and heard, and get at the crux of their struggle, and thereby live more freely, especially the inner life, have much more access to the inner life.
Yeah, I just, Otto Rank was actually going to Alfred Adler for his heart condition when he was a young man, and it was a free clinic. And if it hadn't been for Alfred Adler seeing Ronk, who came from a very low SDS, disenfranchised neighborhood, he would have never been found Freud, because Adler encouraged him to read the interpretation of dreams when he was a teenager, and then he wrote a paper called The Counselor, and Adler gave the paper to Freud, and Freud said, "Tell him to come see me." So this kind of community mental health and openness of free clinics is really not new, even though in many cases, as Kurt mentions, I think the word commodified is really kind of a breakdown in the healthcare systems in which we see disparities. But in the history of psychoanalysis, from Francois Dolto's Green Rooms to Alfred Adler's work of free clinics, to today we see community mental health centers like Jeff Freak in Quebec, or Soteria House in LA, and Burlington, Vermont, and other venues. I think that there's always been within the field a sense of psychosocial mindfulness. So I would leave it at that. But I think it's a tradition that needs to constantly be rediscovered. And I think there's other mitigating circumstances, but that's a long conversation.
10 seconds. First of all, Kirk has my vote, and everyone else should jump in. He has been gracious to help us. I'm working with researchers, and we're trying to think about treatments that are scalable, that could be administered in a variety of ways, and that can be distributed to big groups of people. So I do think that there's a lot of things to be enthusiastic about on the horizon. And this is awesome.
Amazing. Thank you. So I'm wondering, panelists, are you all right with 2 more questions and going an extra 5 minutes? Otherwise, we can wrap up.
Sure.
I'm fine with it. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So we'll go ahead with a couple of more here. So we have an audience member wondering if there has been existential psychotherapy applied to couples and family therapy, and sort of what does that look like in practice?
Ernesto Spinelli, in his book, The Tales of Unknowing, writes about his approach to couples and family therapy and through case studies. I defer to
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not aware of a lot of literature in that area. I think it's very much a pioneering field for this perspective, and I encourage people to pursue it. Seems extremely relevant. I mean, Irvin Yalom certainly did a lot of the groundwork with his group therapy ideas and bringing an existential perspective to that, and that could be translated, to the interpersonal couples level as well.
There's an existential.
I was just going to say, Ora Krug also has been doing some
Yes.
interesting work on existential couples therapy. So,
Yes, I think they're interconnecting links, of existential affinities and the spirit of existential work that you find in a number of, psychosocial systems thinking, as well as someone like Tom Malone's writing on experiential psychotherapy, when he studied with Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. So that kind of thinking's been percolating for many, many years, since the 40s. So you find threads running through a lot of these particular practitioners that use the mindfulness of existential thinking in their couples and family work.
That's right. And to tag on quickly, the experiential democracy dialogue, which I've been facilitating online mostly with
Yes.
people of very contrasting backgrounds, political, cultural, is also a form of
Yes,
existential encounter,
yes.
couples level, if you will. Draws a lot from Braver Angels, which has been doing a lot of that work with conflict mediation.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all of your insights. So we'll go ahead and ask the final question here. It'll be two pretty interrelated questions, so bear with me as I read this. We have exceeded our capacity as a world of consumers. The end as we know it is imminent. As more and more people realize this reality, how will society escape endless terror? Relatedly, in light of the polarized times we live in, how might a therapist draw from Becker's and Ronk's insights to support diverse client populations experiencing heightened levels of existential isolation?
I would just say quickly, I'm very curiously what my colleagues think, but I would say that the emphasis that thinking of Ronk's writing about difference, exceeds a particular binary thought thinking and closing down of particular definitions. I mean, Ronk did not like the word technique because he felt like it was too sterile. He preferred a process, and I think that I think that the notion of difference, Ronk would see that there's life in variation, and that the hope would be constantly is to celebrate that particular reality in the world, and that's what he emphasizes constantly, is trying to find a way to affirm the many differences in ourselves and in others, where that I think that would be, as Stephen Mitchell would say, that's where hope is. That he says hope is not really discussed enough sometimes in our work, and I think that in the sense of this sense of obliqueness that the questioner points to, certainly that's the reality, but by affirming the tragic as a reality, Ronk says we take it into ourselves, and we're able then to use it in a way that would be different if we denied it. And that's what he means by the volitional affirmation of the obligatory. The obligatory means the tragic. So we have to willingly take the tragic into our own, he says. And then by doing that, the ego ideal becomes more human. And so I think that might be one response to this kind of purgatorial moment that we find in history right at the time. But I'm curious what my colleagues would think.
Well, again, I would add that I think we're in a national emergency right now in terms of the psychology of difference, of divisiveness, et cetera. And that's why I think a national program like a core of mental health professionals who both volunteer perhaps part of their time, even a fragment, to low-cost, in-depth relational and perhaps longer-term therapy in underserved areas is so critical. We need much more funding for that, government funding. I think the government basically needs to see it as like a works progress administration type situation. Mm-hmm. We just need to infuse the country with the availability of these kinds of emotionally restorative relationships.
Yes. Budgets are moral documents.
Absolutely. It's time to challenge that moral. I don't know, Sheldon, you have some thoughts on that?
Again, to be silly, it'd be great if we had another couple of dozen hours to address the last question was in many
Yes.
ways the most robustly universal. Um, my 60-second take is agreeing with Kirk. We're in a different world that I don't think we have adequately recognized as individuals, and certainly not as a society. We're in the aftermath of the pandemic with the earth burning and racism and xenophobia on the rise, and fascism already here. And But I think we tend to see those problems as unrelated and having nothing to do with psychology when they are all malignant manifestations of death anxiety. And so we live in a world where we are now inundated with intimations of mortality, and it should not surprise us, therefore, that we're going to be increasingly fragmented and tranquilized by the trivial and polarized. And so the question about how we reduce this kind of polarization, I'm with Kirk and with Claude that we need to devote, we need a psychological Marshall Plan, and it's time to get out all of the resources to effectively manage these difficulties. And the one thing I would say, though, and it sounds silly, but not, it's really the trick, at least in our mind, is how do we get humanity to recognize that our in-group is everybody? Because basically we are designed by evolution to be uber social, hyper cooperative, even heroically altruistic creatures when it's a member of our own tribe. And Tom Pazinski and his students have done studies where if you remind people of our common humanity, that we all have more in common than we are different, which has the benefit of actually being true, that eradicates defensive reactions to death reminders. And so a basic expansion of our identity and our shared interdependence, Judith Butler talking about that we're all interconnected, and the faster we see ourselves as such, I think the better we be in a position to aikido our natural tendencies to be pro-social and proactive. And when the whole tribe is everybody on earth, I know it sounds like Walt Disney, but let's take a shot at that.
Yeah, brings up the importance of bridge building dialogues among people from different cultures. And some of our leaders modeling that in government, right? At the diplomatic level and at the deliberative level. So, all tasks.
So well said, all of you. Yeah, maybe that first step of the Marshall Plan is just channeling the love that exists in all of us through conversations like these, right? I want to thank all of the panelists again so much, as well as everyone who attended the webinar. Thank you all so much for your time. I know that I don't just speak for myself when I say that this was an incredibly treasured conversation that will be cherished forever. If you enjoyed this webinar, please consider supporting future webinars by making a donation at our website or linked in the description to this YouTube video below. If you're interested in keeping up to date with future webinars and news at the foundation, make sure you're on our monthly email list. You can sign up on our homepage. Thanks again. Take care, everybody.
Good to be with you.